Good afternoon. Thank you for joining today's Congressional Briefing on Oligo Brain Cancer. My name is Liz Pell. I'm the head of G2G Consulting. And today is about bravery, determination, and making a difference. I want to thank Chairman Aderholt of the Labor, Health, and Human Services Appropriations Subcommittee, who had wanted to join us today, but his schedule conflicted, and so last minute could not join us. But he sends his best as a big supporter, as he has been personally touched by Oligodendroglioma. I also want to thank Congressman Huffman of California. He is an active supporter and is sharing remarks with us today, and he's a member of the Rare Disease Caucus. So would love to turn it over to Congressman Huffman.
Hi, everyone. My name is Congressman Jared Huffman, and I have the honor of representing California's beautiful 2nd Congressional District. It spans from just north of the Golden Gate Bridge all the way up to the Oregon border. And I am very proud to have Oligo Nation leaders in this fight and partners with G2G as part of my district. Thank you for inviting me to share a few words as part of this important event that is bringing together oligo advocates, researchers, and survivors. Simply put, oligo brain tumors have been ignored, and it's past time that we change that. It receives no government funding, and we have not seen advancements in care and treatments for decades. This is unacceptable, and I want to help you change that. From my position in Congress, I was able to lead the Oligo Nation's appropriations request for the fiscal year 2024, directing the National Institute of Health to dedicate research funding toward the disease and to provide a report on their progress in advancing translational research. With an increase in funding for medical research, we can finally rectify this injustice, support patients and their families, and find a way to defeat this disease and save lives. I'll keep doing all I can to support your work and to be a partner in this fight. And I hope you find this briefing today educational and informative, and that you all come away with a deeper understanding of the need for urgent action on this issue. Thanks again.
Thank you, Congressman Huffman. Really appreciate that support. Our speakers make up an impressive panel today. We will hear from each speaker, then open it up for questions and answers with all of them. First, Dr. Nader Sanai is an internationally recognized neurosurgical oncologist with clinical and research expertise in the treatment of all brain tumors. He is the Chief Scientific Officer and Director of the Ivy Brain Tumor Center in Phoenix, Arizona. He runs to what most of us avoid and run away from, and that is the highest risk, most complex forms of cancer. He has performed over 3,000 brain tumor surgeries since 2010. He has published over 200 peer-reviewed research manuscripts and delivered over 200 national and international lectures on brain tumor research. He oversees all translational brain tumor research at the center and is one of only a handful of neurosurgeons in the entire United States to have served as a principal investigator on multiple NIH R01 grants. A true expert, I am so honored to introduce Dr. Sanai. He will be immediately followed by a caregiver named Kristen Spain. She has been on a grueling journey and turned that pain into action, becoming a powerful advocate for change. So I'm thrilled to start with Dr. Nader Sanai, followed by Kristen Spain.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Liz, for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Dr. Nader Sanai. I'm the director of the Ivy Brain Tumor Center at the Dabbiere Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm also a neurosurgeon who specializes in brain tumor surgeries, and I'm happy here to share our understanding of oligodendrogliomas for this congressional audience. Probably the most important take-home message for anyone trying to understand this issue is the lack of progress that's been seen throughout the entire brain tumor community. These are two survival curves span 20 years apart for our nation's patients with brain tumors of various types. And simply put, across the board, we haven't seen any progress with respect to improving survival benefits for this population. Oligodendrogliomas, or oligos for short, are a subtype of primary brain tumors that we see throughout the world. Primary brain tumors themselves are tumors that arise from the brain tissue, which means that if we're treating them or removing them, for example, we're actually removing regions of the brain tissue itself, and that, of course, has consequences. These are spontaneous brain tumors. They're not known to have any specific risk factors. They don't have any specific socioeconomic, ethnic, or environmental predilections. And these are tumors that most often afflict the young. The most common age range is 25 to 45 years of age, which means that these patients are often healthy, have a lot to lose, and many decades of life ahead of them before encountering what is today considered to be an incurable tumor with a median survival in the United States of 10 to 12 years. You don't need to be a brain tumor surgeon to see the scan on the left and see this blotchy white mass on the scan and know that there's an issue there. This is what an oligodendroglioma can look like on MR imaging. This is what it can look like to the human eye, and this is a craniotomy in what's called an awake stimulation mapping case. Oftentimes, these tumors need to be resected, but they are located in regions of the brain that control language function. And so for that reason, tumor surgeons like myself have to keep patients awake for a portion of the procedure so we can test those language functions in the patient's brain and know what regions are safe and not safe to remove. The numbers on the left on the surface of this tumor indicate regions that have been tested for language function. Ultimately, when this tumor is removed, we're removing, as I mentioned, a portion of the patient's brain, a disease portion that itself can have functions, and loss of those functions can affect quality of life. Today, we really only have four dimensions of tools available to us to treat oligos. Surgery, as I mentioned, is the common denominator for almost all patients. And for most patients, this is the only treatment they get initially. Later on, as the tumor progresses, many of these patients will then go on to receive radiation therapy and a single chemotherapy drug called temozolomide, which is the only drug we have today that has any benefit whatsoever. And then for some patients, they also have an electromagnetic cap attached to their head that they have to wear 20 plus hours a day. This cap elicits these tumor treatment fields, which can disrupt tumor growth to a certain extent. Ultimately, however, what we're really in desperate need of are new drugs. And that's exactly what we haven't been able to develop over the last 40 years. In fact, the 5 drugs that are available today for brain tumor patients of any variety are relatively old and all relatively ineffective. Some of them are simply derivatives of mustard gas. So these are true chemotherapeutics that are toxins that are designed to hopefully poison a patient's tumor before they poison a patient's brain and body. There are other drugs on this list that have been FDA approved but have no survival benefit. So this is a consequence of the desperate need for new drug approvals and the fact that sometimes it happens even when there's inadequate data to support prolonging a patient's life. And there is at least one drug that's really only applicable for a very rare subtype of brain tumors that happens in small children. So this leaves us with that single drug temozolomide that I mentioned, which has some marginal effect in pushing tumors back, but certainly is not curative. Now, why is it that we're not seeing this kind of progress or the progress we'd like to see for oligos in the drug development field? Well, number one, it's a complicated disease. What you see on the left is a pattern of chromosomes in a normal cell like your body or mine. There are 23 pairs of chromosomes, and these encode all of our genetic material. And then on the right, what you see is the incredible aberrancies and abnormalities in a human brain tumor. So these are extremely mutated and twisted biologies that can lead to challenges when you're trying to treat it. Of course, these challenges can be overcome, and they are being overcome for many other cancers, but the development of new drugs for cancer is pretty much directly proportional to the market size of that cancer. And so what you see here is that for brain tumors, and oligos are a small fraction of this, the market size pales in comparison to other oncological subdivisions. And so one can directly predict the number of FDA drugs or FDA approvals developed from new drugs over the course of time as a function of this market size. And as a consequence of that, there's also a direct relationship between these new drug developments and national trends in cancer death rates and improvements therein. And in fact, cancers like lung cancers and certain types of skin cancers, breast cancers have all enjoyed improvements in survivability, whereas brain cancers have actually worsened in the intervening time. Of course, we're here to talk about congressional support and federal support. And historically, the federal support for translational science for brain tumors has gradually been whittled down in the preceding decades. In the 1990s, the community at the NCI and the NIH really made a direct shift towards cultivating early phase clinical trials and studies for brain cancer. And over time, this led to the formation of 3 different national brain tumor consortia that were supported and directed to help develop new drugs for brain tumor patients. But as time has passed, those 3 consortia have been whittled down to 2, and several years ago reduced to a single consortia. And just a couple years ago, this last consortium had its funding discontinued, and now we have none. Congressional leadership really will be essential to turn the tides for oligo patients. What we're hoping for is the first time ever prioritization of funds for oligos, oligo tumor biology, oligo drug development, and oligo patient support. And to try to direct these resources away from basic discovery level work in animals and towards clinical trials and tissue-based trials in patients. Doing this would really signal to the academic community and to our industry partners a federal recognition of clearly an unmet need. And it'll also spotlight a relatively unseen population of patients that are dealing with and trying to survive oligos, as well as the community of caregivers that are also assisting and living through this every day as well. I'd finally leave you with the take-home message that a cure for brain cancer and for oligos in particular is within reach. We've seen progress like this in other oncologies. It is simply a matter of attention, resources, and focus. If we prioritize drug development for oligos, and in particular, emphasize drug repurposing so we don't have to build everything from the ground up, this will make a difference. Emphasizing early phase clinical trials for oligo patients is essential. There are very few, if any, clinical trials dedicated for oligo patients and oligo tumors. And creating opportunities at the federal level for private-public partnerships. Greasing the wheels for collaboration and partnership with our industry, biopharma, biotech, correspondents. This will help accelerate new therapies. And in partnership with this new therapeutic development, we need new abilities to get these drugs into brain tumors, and the technology gap that exists there can be overcome with directed effort. So with that, I'll thank you for the audience, your time, your efforts, and your concerns for this critical tumor patient population.
We had, no reason to think that anything was out of the norm. He went to work as usual, had a seizure that morning, and one thing led to another, and he was diagnosed with this brain tumor. When he was first in the hospital recovering from the seizure, and we were just figuring out exactly what was going on, I remember one of the docs on call came by and was trying to reassure me and said, no, like, it's okay. People with this type of tumor can live for possibly a decade, maybe more. And while I know that was meant to be reassuring, all I could do was picture my 11-month-old daughter who would be 10, almost 11, a decade from then. And so that wasn't really all that reassuring to me. But anyway, moving forward from there, he had surgery at Duke to remove his tumor. He had an awake surgery. And I'm very happy that he did, because at one point during the surgery, he was unable to count past 20 without stuttering. Well, he's a numbers guy. He works with numbers for a living. So if that part of his brain had been operated on, then, his livelihood would be over. We're lucky that his personality is mostly very much intact, same as it's always been. He has, since surgery, and then that was followed by proton radiation and chemo, he has had a promotion at work. He's very involved with our kids. He's a great dad, but it hasn't come without its challenges. For instance, he was taking Keppra, which is a very one of the more common anti-seizure medications to control his seizures. Well, that comes with a host of side effects, one of them being Keppra rage, as some people call it. That really affected his moods and made things honestly kind of difficult at home for a while. And I didn't know, is this the tumor causing this? Is this the medication that he's on? It caused issues, with him and our kids, particularly our oldest son, who, as I had mentioned, he was 6, almost 7 when his dad was diagnosed. And he was really old enough to kind of grasp that this was a really serious issue that we were dealing with, not, run of the mill, dad's sick and he's going to get better. But it's caused him, he's been in therapy. He worries about his dad a lot. We've been lucky enough that things have been stable. However, we did have a scare back in December. We had a scan that looked like possibly new tumor growth. And we were, as honest as possible. We told our son that the doctors were keeping an eye on his dad's brain, on the scan. We're making sure that everything's okay. There may be something a little bit suspicious. We don't know. We're keeping an eye on it. But he took that information and he just assumed, well, the tumor's back. My dad's cancer is back. And he cried himself to sleep Christmas Eve. The scan was the day before he got out for Christmas break. So it's just really tough as a family living with this. We kind of live our life right now, us personally, in 4-month increments. He scans every 4 months, and we're just kind of crossing our fingers, hoping that the other shoe doesn't drop. Because as Dr. Sanai said, the unfortunate thing about these types of brain tumors is surgery is not a cure-all. We have to expect that at some point there will be change, and we'll have to deal with that change as it comes. And backtracking a little bit, after I had that initial conversation with the doctor who said, oh, but people can live for a decade, maybe more with this, I immediately came home from the hospital, started researching, thought, well, that can't be right. Let me figure out what our options are. And so I was, really a little bit discouraged when I realized that the standard of care today is still the exact same as it was in the 1990s. And we just really need to take action and change that, because people diagnosed with oligos are, in the prime of their lives. As Dr. Sanai also said, they're between 25 and 45 years old on average. And they have their whole futures ahead of them. So anyway, I just wanted to take a few minutes to kind of share how it is going through this as the spouse, as the caregiver, as, the mom to kids of a brain tumor patient. Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate your sharing that. From caregiver to patient, all the perspectives and insights are incredibly valuable as we seek to improve care overall. Patients are the voice that is truly needed in this effort. And that is why I'm really excited to introduce our next speaker, who is a patient survivor. Ashley Dabbiere is one of the strongest people you'll ever meet. One look at her and she's got it all together, strong, determined, a true fighter, and an impressive leader in this campaign to educate, raise awareness, and drive meaningful change for those facing oligo brain cancer. I turn it over to you, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Liz, for your kind introduction. And you, Dr. Sanai, your description of oligodendroglioma research and treatment was very informative. And Kristen, thank you for sharing your story. I've seen how this disease can be hardest on the caregiver, and you're very strong. My experience with brain cancer begins 11 years ago. I was just 44 years old, a very busy mom with 4 babies, ages 8 years old and under. I was living life to the fullest with a wonderful husband and family doing all the mom things, but at the same time, I just didn't feel right. I was forgetting things, having a hard time focusing, struggling to find words, and my doctors told me, "You're fine." They said I just had baby brain, which made sense, but that just didn't sit right with me. Despite a lot of self-doubt and being told I was imagining things, I kept pushing to find out what was wrong with me while everyone was pushing back. My doctor did test after test, but of course, he wasn't looking for a brain issue. Family doctors just don't look for that. They look for a pain, an illness, a fever. I wasn't experiencing any of the traditional tumor symptoms like seizures, headaches, or blurred vision. So a brain tumor simply wasn't on the list. After 6 months of tests that turned up nothing, I decided it was time for a brain MRI, even though my doctor didn't approve it. And I learned at this moment to listen to your body. If something doesn't feel right with your body, it's probably not, and you better pay attention. So I pushed for the MRI test. To say that the results of my MRI was a shock is the understatement of a lifetime. It was the shock of my life in the prime of my life. What the scan revealed was I had a brain tumor, a grade 2 oligodendroglioma. We discovered it early because of that test, but you sure didn't have to squint to see it on the scan. My tumor looked like it was a quarter the size of my brain. Everything I read at the time told me brain tumors are fatal, but I just couldn't accept it was time for me to die at age 44 from a brain tumor. My family needed me, so I decided this tumor was messing with the wrong person and I wasn't going to give up. Standard protocol at the time, 11 years ago, was automatic chemo and radiation, a combination that can often backfire or have little to no effect. But my family and I worked hard to find the best care we could. And fortunately for me, my medical team at UCSF had the experience to know that the right thing for me was aggressive surgery and then to watch and wait. It's impossible to surgically remove brain cancer entirely. I'm told it's like sand on jello, but my surgery turned out well and most of the cancer was removed, but it's not all gone. I still need to be monitored every 90 days. I never imagined I would be fighting for my life every 3 months for the rest of my life. But in many respects, I'm one of the lucky ones. Many of my friends that are in the club aren't doing so well. Many are experiencing deficits, lost their jobs, lost their families, lost their mobility. Some lost their lives. This is not a club you want to be in. Of course, having brain cancer has completely changed my life. And I've learned that the 2 most important days of your life are the day you're born and the day you realize why you're born. I've realized it's my purpose to become a voice for all patients and do all I can to fight this terrible disease for myself and others. The fact that my tumor is slow growing means I have runway, time to make a difference. And that's why I'm here today. You know, brain cancer kills more people under 40 than any other cancer. Still, only 35% of those diagnosed live up to 5 years. Clearly, not enough is being done to fight this terrible disease. And when it comes to funding, brain tumor research really boxes below its weight. There are a number of reasons for this. Brain tumors can be an invisible disease. When you look at me, you wouldn't guess that I have a cancerous brain tumor, but it does take a deep toll. People don't like to talk about brain cancer. It's a dreadful subject. And if you've lost a loved one to it, you want to forget about it. If you're living with it, chances are you don't want to talk about it. You want to forget about it too. Together, I believe we can transform brain tumors from something that steals your life into something you can live with and live a full life. We can do this if we innovate and put our best ideas and efforts forward, because patients like me and so many others are counting on you and the medical and research community to find answers. While having brain cancer has given me a mission, it's also been a huge shock to me and my family, and it doesn't stop. It's wrecked my family's life. Emotionally, this is a roller coaster. Every day I worry about how it's progressing. And every 90 days I get scanxiety right before my routine scan. While the growth of the cancer is slow, the prognosis is devastating. It's a death sentence. It's depressing and overwhelming, and it certainly isn't fair. In my own body, I feel the effects of my tumor. Over the past couple of years, I've noticed some cognitive decline. I'm more forgetful. I'm more impulsive. At times, details confuse me. I've experienced a lack of judgment. And now I'm self-conscious about how I'm acting because of my brain. Maybe even more difficult, this cancer has torn my family apart. Living with my cancer has always been hard on my 4 kids. It's led to a lot of stress and upheaval in our home. And most recently, it's become too much for my husband, who was so supportive in the beginning, but after 23 years of marriage, we are divorcing. There's no doubt this cancer is a killer emotionally, physically, and socially, and it doesn't give up. But this is still my mission and my purpose, and I'm not giving up either. It's my hope that in my lifetime, we can make brain cancer a chronic and treatable disease instead of a fatal one. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to all of us today.
Wow. Thank you for your bravery, for sharing. You are amazing. Truly amazing. Our last speaker is also someone personally touched by oligo brain tumors and brain cancer. Patient advocate Brock Greene has truly transformed how we think about brain cancer, about where our dollars are going when it comes to research, and why it is so important to dedicate resources towards oligo brain cancer in particular. He started a nonprofit solely dedicated to advancing care for oligodendroglioma and has become an amazing national leader advocating for change. So I'd love to pass it over to Brock Greene.
Well, thank you, Liz. Thank you, Dr. Sanai, Kristen, and Ashley. Hearing you guys talk brings up the emotion in me, because this is an emotional experience when you have to live with something like this. But I'll try and get it back together and share my screen. Okay, so I've got 2 sides to my story, and the first is as a father and a person living with this disease in my family, and the other is what I've done and what I've discovered looking at the brain tumor world and the potential for new treatments. So in the beginning, it starts with my kids. My son Spencer on the right was diagnosed a few days before his 17th birthday. He was just about to start his senior year in high school. And then on the left is Zach. Obviously, he just had not obviously his first, but he did just have his first brain surgery. He was 21 and at UCLA. So that's where it started, and this is where they are now. We've been, we've been lucky. I mean, Spencer on the left has been living with this disease for 15 years. He's with his wife Stephanie. Zach has been living with this disease for 13 years. He's with his fiance, Erica. And I mean, yeah, these are my kids, so of course this is what motivates me. But look, this is who we serve, or this is who I serve. This is the group of people in their 20s, their 30s, early 40s, starting their lives, really getting cooking, getting married, having kids. They're like right in the middle of it, So and like there aren't many diseases that look like that, honestly. So after my second son was diagnosed and I pulled myself off the floor, I realized that the two people I cared about the most in my life were at grave risk, and I had to do something. So I'd given some money to a brain tumor foundation after Spencer was diagnosed, and belatedly went to their website to find out they were not doing anything about oligo. And then I looked at the other brain tumor foundations. They weren't doing anything about oligo. Then I looked at the research institutions like MD Anderson or Memorial Sloan Kettering, and they weren't doing anything on oligo. So I kind of realized that there wasn't much going on. I was going to have to try to do something about it. So why is it that nobody has paid attention to this disease? Well, I mean, money is sort of an easy answer, and there's certainly a fair amount of truth in that. But one of the things, and this came up in Kristen's talk, but it's weird, like the neuro-oncology world, not everybody, of course, but there's definitely like this sense that oligo patients are lucky, right? Because they don't have a GPM. And if that's your only measure, yeah, I guess that's true. But I just think that there's a feeling like, oh, well, we've got time for that. Like oligo is not an immediate problem. And maybe it's not the day you're diagnosed, but guess what? There are plenty of people that were diagnosed 10 years ago. It's a real problem for them now. So I think just, lack of money and this sort of feeling that there are bigger problems to solve has led to oligo being ignored pretty routinely. Glioblastoma, which is 10 times more prevalent than our disease, and way more malignant and aggressive, gets most of what funding is available in the brain tumor space. And we are a rare cancer, and we have all the problems that rare cancers have in terms of resources. There's no biobank, there's no disease models, there's no advanced sequencing data, which is where you unlock how the cancer operates and identify potential new treatments. There's no clinical trial consortia, which Dr. Sanai pointed out. There are no clinical trial consortia for brain tumors at all anymore. So into that void, we jumped in. And our mission is pretty straightforward. It's identify new, more effective treatments for oligodendroglioma in 3 to 5 years. The part of that statement that is most important is the 3 to 5 years, because the medical industrial complex, or whatever we want to consider it, has been very comfortable with the idea of like a decade or two to bring a new treatment to market. That's changing, fortunately, now, but that has been the way. We've raised $4 million. We've made 24 grants to leading investigators in the US and Europe. We are building a biobank and cell line repository. One of the things that's really started to happen and kind of manifest in the last couple of years is we've got a pretty connected oligo community now, which has allowed us to better recruit for clinical trials. And we've built a wonderful network of scientific advisors to help us make the best investments we can with the money we have. In terms of the personal journey, I think you've gotten a sense for this. I'll just throw a couple of things into this. I mean, life is never the same. I mean, for a million reasons, perhaps, but the two that stand out to me is first, critical beliefs and life assumptions are upended or destroyed. For me, my kids are going to live longer than I am, live past me, right? And maybe I'll be a grandparent. Maybe I'll get to retire. All those things are kind of like thrown into the void. And one of the things that I've come to realize is that the future is no longer where our dreams live. You think of anybody's life, right? There's always problems with the present, right? But the future, we're going to do this, and we're going to accomplish that, and we're going to go there. And the future is so important to living our life and being happy every day because it is opportunity. And when you have this disease, the future is dominated by fear. Yes, I started fighting to keep my boys alive, but now I'm connected to so many people in the community that I care about, and sadly, I worry about them too. I think one thing that is really true for almost everybody in our world is that it's pretty lonely. It's a very solitary journey. Other people can't understand what you're going through or what it feels like. And I'm not sure they should, honestly, but you just can't look forward the way you could have before this. And depression is super common. And then in my family, we certainly take turns being strong for one another because I don't know if it's because I'm the father or because I'm Oligo Nation, but I need to be the rock for my family and especially my wife. Don't get me wrong, this is no picnic being a father, but I think for my wife, it's twice as bad. So looking at the brighter side, why am I optimistic? And there are a number of reasons. Actually, probably about 4 or 5 years into Oligo Nation, I transitioned from hopeful to optimistic, which you might think, well, that's kind of the same thing. But it's really not. When you're living it, that's a big difference. There's been great progress in so many other cancers. Survival rates are over 90% in breast cancer, prostate cancer, melanoma is heading in that direction. And the funding for the research of these diseases has paid off. I think that's the big takeaway, that these are solvable problems, but you need to be able to put the money behind it to get there. Biology, my expression of myself is biology is endless. You may never know it all, but our understanding of cancers and how they work continues to grow. We sequence DNA and then RNA and then proteomics and metabolomics. And, we're continuing to uncover how cancer operates. And if we can understand those things better, we can figure out how to make it not operate and to kill it. I will say that people like Dr. Sanai and his colleagues in the neuro-oncology community, they're like my biggest reason for optimism because, and I don't want to embarrass you, Dr. Sanai, but the passion, the brilliance, the dedication, and actually, one thing that is weird about neuro-oncologists is like the humility, right? Because this is a disease that so far we haven't figured out how to beat it. I'm hopeful because Oligo Nation can now do things that really help, like this meeting. And we got 836 signatures for our letter of support for the appropriations chairs and co-chairs, which Liz says is the most they've ever gotten on a letter. For clinical trials, this might be more relevant. You may not know that many rare cancer trials fail because they never reach their enrollment targets. And we have, in my opinion, kind of completely solved for that with Oligo Nation. We were a huge part of a phase 3 trial where they were getting 330 patients enrolled, and more than half of them ended up being oligo patients, and they enrolled that trial a year early. And then the last thing, and it's hard to say something good about COVID, I know, but I think COVID showed that it doesn't take decades to get effective therapies into the clinic. And Yes, I don't know how many billions of dollars it took, but like one of the things that is true in probably any enterprise, but certainly in medicine, is there's a lot of process and red tape, and the idea that we can accelerate things into the clinic, especially for people that are out of options, which is where we in our community will all end up there, whether it's in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or 20 years. I mean, as it stands today. So I'm really hopeful that FDA and NIH and others are really looking at how do we get there faster. Government supportive research is just necessary because, I said we raised $4 million. You guys know, that's not even a drop in the bucket. That's not, we're like several digits away from being a rounding error in Washington, D.C. So it's expensive. Doing medical research is expensive for a lot of reasons, including that you're trying to solve a problem you don't even know what's driving it. To some extent, you have to discover that first. So we really need the funding. But the other thing is, and Dr. Sanai touched on this, the ripple effect on academic research and pharmacy, the pharma industry, if we are funding oligo work. For instance, as a researcher, you're going to write the grants that are going to get approved, right? Why would you write grants that you don't think have the best chance of being approved? You have a lab to run, you're trying to get tenure, all these things that are part of your life, they're real. So nobody writes a grant for oligo because oligo grants don't get approved. Brain tumor funding has been a very small fraction of funding that goes to other cancers so far. We've touched on that. I do want to commend Congress for providing more money to NIH and to NIH for providing more money to the brain tumor group at NCI. The oligo research has not seen the benefit of that yet, but I'm sure it's making a difference for brain tumors in general. Our audience is just such an unusual audience. And NCI knows that they've underserved the adolescent young adult group, but I'm not sure what the solution to that has been, if there is one. And the proof is in the pudding, I guess you might say, but since 2000, a single grant has been made solely focused on oligodendroglioma, and that was in 2007. A lot of stuff has changed since 2007 in medical research. And so we're hoping that you guys can adopt this language, which essentially just says, direct NIH to dedicate research funding towards oligodendroglioma. We're not saying how much, we're not saying how to spend it, but just get us on the radar. And you've met a bunch of people that are touched by oligo and work in oligo in this session, but I do want to let you know that there are a lot more people out there that are just like us, that are hoping that we can count on your support going forward. And that's it. So thank you, and we'll turn it over to questions.
Thank you so much, Brock. That's so powerful. All of you have been amazing, sharing your stories, perspectives, expertise today. We do have some questions coming in. A comment about your amazed by your bravery. I want you all to hear that. We'd love to hear from Dr. Sanai if he thinks effective treatments in 3 to 5 years is an achievable timeframe with enough funding and attention, and added, my sister is an oligo survivor.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Absolutely. There's nothing magical about this disease. It plays by the same rules as others. It just hasn't gotten the attention. And what we've learned in oncology and cancer is that when something gets our attention, we find solutions. The best evidence for that is the newfound survivability of breast cancer, skin cancer, lung cancer. These are things that were death sentences for many Americans just a few years ago, and now they were absolutely manageable. So it really is a question of attention and the scale of effort.
And another question related for you, how many oligo clinical trials are there right now? And what's sort of the landscape overall for oligo clinical trials?
So there are currently 0 oligo clinical trials specifically for oligo patients. There are a handful of clinical trials for low-grade glioma patients that allow oligo patients to enter, but those drugs and therapies were not developed with the biology of oligo patients and their tumors in mind. Those drugs were developed for low-grade gliomas. And sometimes there can be overlap of effect, but certainly the addition of the oligo patients was not part of the strategic plan when developing the drug.
And I would just add that even in clinical trials where oligos kind of get in through the back door, if you will, they're not excluded, so they become part of the trial. Every once in a while, you see a result that indicates that this could be effective for oligo patients, but it doesn't get followed up on because that wasn't what the trial was about.
Agree.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And I know, Ashley, you had talked about having oligo for so many years. So can you share some insights on that length of time and maybe how that fits into participating in clinical trials or in the research that's ongoing?
Sure, I can tell you how I feel about that. I feel so fortunate that I'm at 11 years, but I don't call myself a survivor because it's an incurable disease. So I'm surviving, which is great. And I'm hopeful because there's runway to make a difference. And I'm committed to that every day. I've been in one clinical trial. My one clinical trial that I've been in, I started right before COVID. It was at UCSF and it was on imaging. And basically what it was is I was injected with something called a C13 isotope that actually was trying to detect the cancer before it formed. And that trial got put on hold when COVID happened. I mean, my doctors said, don't come here during COVID. So I'm no longer in that trial, but that trial is still ongoing. And one of the reasons it's so important is the only way to detect tumor growth is through imaging. And so not only are we trying to focus on research and treatments of the disease, but we're also trying to focus on imaging and machines and just trying to get that worked out so so we can detect it sooner rather than later.
That's really helpful. And then Kristen, as the caregiver, what's your thoughts on, what you knew about research that's out there, what you could get involved with for your husband and how that's impacted your family?
Well, like I said, it was just really disappointing to find out that virtually no progress had been made since the 90s in terms of treatment. However, we were inspired to go the proton radiation route, which is relatively newer for brain tumor patients. The thought process behind that is that hopefully, as I said, he was 37 at the time he was diagnosed. And the hope is that because proton radiation is more targeted, that it will not ultimately affect healthy areas of his brain as much, because many brain tumor patients are seemingly fine for a year or two or even more. Patients that have had traditional photon radiation, and then over time, they experience significant deficits from the radiation damage. And actually, it was one of my husband's neuro-oncologists that really pushed us in this direction, because he shared with us that his wife is a long-term brain tumor survivor, and she was doing very well. She had a great career as a nurse, and over time, all of that deteriorated. And so we are hopeful about proton radiation. We're not even quite at the 5-year mark. So I guess time will tell, but so far so good in terms of that. But otherwise, we're just really driven to stay involved with Oligo Nation and do whatever we can to make sure that this disease gets the funding that it so much deserves. And one more thing to that point, unlike diseases like breast cancer or melanoma patients, there's no early detection for a brain tumor. So, even more so, we need treatments that will really help our patients.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So we've got some more questions here. Dr. Sanai, why does oligo routinely affect younger people? Do we know why?
We don't know why. We don't even know where these tumors come from. In general, for tumors that do affect younger people, a common etiology is that the tumors are arising from developmental cells, progenitor cells that are in our brain, and increasingly when you're younger. And then as we get older, they kind of peter off. So that's a hypothesis, but the fact is that nobody knows what the origin of these tumors are.
Okay, we've got another question for you. Would mRNA vaccines be possible avenue to treat oligos? If the funding were available, would it be mRNA vaccines that would be worth the investment?
Well, cancer vaccines are an experimental strategy. In general, mRNA vaccines are a version of that. So it's an open question. This hasn't been attempted. mRNA vaccine technology and development is an expensive avenue for therapeutic development. So it certainly is not at the top of the list of what centers have tried, but it's worth exploring.
Another one for you. Are there any in vitro cell lines for oligo?
Yeah, so growing cells in a dish is a common way of just answering some basic questions about tumors. And there are very, very few cell lines for oligos, and those that do exist, there's a healthy level of skepticism that they represent what's actually happening in patients' brains. So just another example of how for this particular tumor, oligos, we don't even have the basic tools that we have for other tumor versions, like Brock mentioned, like glioblastoma.
I will add that to the skeptic, a cell line is the least likely to, it's a starting point, as Dr. Sanai points out. It's not doesn't recapitulate the disease accurately, probably for any disease, but it's a starting point. We do, when we do have, Oligo Nation has a cell line repository, has 5 cell lines in it, and we can get it to patients. We've also funded work on surgically explanted organoids, which do recapitulate the disease much more accurately. But disease models, as the saying goes, Dr. Sanai, all models are bad, some are useful, right? So that's why you want to use those models, but you want to get to patients as quickly as you can, because that's where, we've cured a lot of mice, not any people yet.
Agree.
Okay. Is there any way to reverse the deficits once an oligo patient experiences them, or are most effects from treatment permanent?
Yeah, that's a critical question for our patients. So I don't think reversal is probably the right word. Deficits can be recovered, and that recovery happens intrinsically, meaning it's your body that does the work. There are things you and people around you can do to help that process, like physical therapy, cognitive therapy, etc. But at the end of the day, there is no drug, there is no device that regenerates brain or helps brain recover faster. There is some intrinsic capacity we all have to recover from any injury, whether it's a brain tumor surgery, a stroke, a head injury, but it's limited. And that's what we struggle with as providers and patients.
Okay. We are just about to wrap up here. There's been some wonderful comments of support and admiration for all of you speaking today. I want to make sure you know that. There was a comment about how expensive it is, the financial burden on families to have to keep doing the imaging, the treatment. So I think that's worth noting. And then finally, there's a last question about dedicated funding. So what I'd like to do is to have each of you answer this question. If we could increase and really focus on dedicated funding for oligo brain cancer, what would that mean for you? Just sort of 10 seconds each, and I will start with Dr. Sanai.
Sure. So an influx of dedicated funding for oligo for us would mean new clinical trials and new experimental therapies for the patients that need them.
Kristen, Spain.
Well, for us, it would just mean hope and really seeing more opportunities in the future.
Ashley, Dabbiere.
For me, it would be a dream come true for myself and for all patients. And all patients want hope. They want to feel like they can live the rest of their life and not miss those moments that Brock was referring to, all of those special family moments and special life moments, and not always wonder what's going to happen to you. And so I do believe the answers are out there. I do believe if we get the funding and we can work together, that we will find a treatment to make this disease chronic. I believe the answers are there. We've come so far. Dr. Sanai even mentioned all the cancers that were a death sentence that now have been cured, and we're close. It's just getting the word out to come together and make a difference.
Awesome. Brock, bring us home.
Well, that's, more money, more trials equals success. It's that simple. Our work is very focused on getting to clinical trials, but we're like we're a mom and pop foundation, with the US government support and the messaging that would deliver to academic and pharma. I feel certain we could have effective treatments in, 5 years if we really got some funding and got people focused.
Wonderful. Thank you all for your comments today. Thank you everyone for dialing in. We truly appreciate your joining this congressional briefing on oligo brain cancer. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.